We're going to talk about machine-based subject indexing and how we did it at our institution. And it's mainly going to be a case study of how we use Annif and what we used before, because it's always been hugely useful for us when other people share their processes and how they use tools that are out there. So for our outline, I've divided the talk into 3 parts. The first is a little bit of context, introducing what we're going to use Annif for, our reference database SYNDEX, and how we index in it, and what vocabularies we use. Then the second part is about automatic indexing in SYNDEX, what we used before, our old system, what we're using now in our Annif setup, and the future plans we still have for using Annif for special tasks. And part 3 is our Annif special, where we're going to talk about a few special cases we found and how we dealt with them. Mostly what we do when some terms are suggested not often enough or suggested too often, and also how we try to mark some subject suggestions that Annif makes for us as main topics of a publication. And then also a little bit about using Annif for other vocabularies that are not strictly subjects, and more like a study level vocabularies. So our institution is the Leibniz Institute for Psychology in Germany, and we're a publicly funded open science institute for psychology for the German-speaking countries. And we support mostly researchers, but also practicing psychologists, students, professors, and also provide psychology information for lay people. SYNDEX is the product we're probably most known for. That's a reference database of psychological literature, mostly scholarly articles and books, but also popular science materials for lay people. Our publications we index are in English and in German, and we have about 1,000 new publications per month. How we index in SYNDEX and what vocabularies we use. We have several that are pretty psychology specific. The largest and most important one warrants its own slide. These are SYNDEX controlled terms, real subjects. And then we have a smaller subject heading classification. We also have an even smaller one that is called controlled methods, but it's more a mix of a publication genre or study type, if it's a psychological study. So it's the meta-analysis or an experimental study. And we also have 2 vocabularies about the study sample population, if it's a study. So the age group is also very small, and the population location, where the people that were studied came from. Of course, we would like Annif to help us with all of these, and currently we use Annif for SYNDEX controlled terms. So the first one in production, and the subject headings are ready for production, and the rest is in testing currently. On that note, our Cosmos instance that we use to support Annif is public now. It's been non-public for a few years, and it's now public on vocabs like in psychology. And most of these vocabularies can be found there. So our most important vocabularies are the controlled terms, or CT. That's a pretty big one with almost 7,000 terms and a quite complex hierarchy. Labels are English and German, and we also have synonyms and hidden labels. And important to know is that it's based on the American Psychological Association's APA thesaurus of psychological index terms, and we only provide the German translations for labels. Which means that we license the thesaurus from the APA. That also means we cannot make it publicly available. That is kind of a problem, because it's not on our Cosmos. We can't allow that based on our terms with the APA. What's important to know, and will come up later, is that we receive updates, new additions to the vocabulary twice a year from the APA, which we translate then and add. and also that our indexers use weighting for this vocabulary. That is, they mark some of the topics in this vocabulary for a publication as the main topics of the publication, and others not. Automatic indexing. We have 1,000 publications a month, so we've always tried to find some help with that. We've been using for the past 15 years a lexical system called AUTINDEX for suggesting controlled terms, which just processed the documents overnight and wrote its suggestions into a special field in our database, which then was displayed to the human indexers so they could copy them and use them. Today, that software is pretty old and quite unmaintained and unstable, and also not really up to date to today's standards in performance. So instead, we've switched to Annif, which is now our suggester for controlled terms since February of this year. Annif, you probably have heard of it, but it's developed at the National Library of Finland, which we're hugely thankful for. On the next 2 or 3 slides, I think we're going to talk about how we switched from our old system to Annif, and how our setup is, how we generate our corpuses and split them, what ensemble and backends we use, and how we optimize them. And also about our plans for the future with Annif. So training it on even more vocabularies, and hopefully use it for completely automatic indexing for part of our records, and what we need for that. So, how did we get from AUTINDEX to Annif? Currently, we use it as a drop-in replacement for the old system, which means suggestions for controlled terms, which are written into the same record field that AUTINDEX wrote to. And we use an Annif ensemble, which is a combination of machine learning trained on the past human index documents, plus a few lexical components, which are quite similar to our old system, AUTINDEX, but of course more advanced. How we got there. First, we had to come up with a complicated system to generate and split our corpus for training, based on publication year, document type, and which parts to use for that. We have a special in detail slide for that too. And then, as to backend selection, we ended up, based on best performance, with the Omikuji Bonsai machine learning part, and added 2 lexical backend components, MLM and STWFSA. And the lexical backends are mostly to help with new additions to the vocabulary that haven't been used yet, so I haven't been really trained with the machine learning yet. As to optimization, we simply used Annif's built-in hyperopt command to determine how much each ensemble backend part should contribute to the ensemble for best performance. And after testing 200 random ratios, came up with a good performing combination. This is one I'm going to skip over quickly, because just how it looks in our XML records, the suggestions, and what the indexers actually used. And this is something I'm going to go over really quickly, just a diagram of how we prepare our corpus. We start out with all our 400 records, and we use the title, abstract, and the uncontrolled keywords that the authors supply with the paper. And then, after much testing, we came up with the publication year that has to be at least 2014 or later. And we decided we wouldn't include collections of papers because conference proceedings and the like are indexed only broadly and not really representative for training. Then we split into German and English documents, so 2 training corpuses. 80% of the documents we use for training the data, and 20% for testing and validation. So we end up with a 80-10-10 ratio. And we do the same thing for English documents as well. maybe that was too quick. So the next part is our future plans with Annif, and that we're going to be fully automatic for some of our publications. That is, for some of our publication genres. We still want human indexing, supported, of course, by suggestions by Annif for our core genre, which are research publications. And then for non-core publication genres, we think these might be able to be automatically indexed without human supervision based on a training data set from human indexers. What we need for that was a way of classifying our documents as core or non-core based on genre or study type. And as already mentioned, we already have a vocabulary for that, the controlled methods. And we were wondering, can Annif do the classification for us? And also, we would like to make Annif mark some of the topics as main topics that it suggests. Both of these are discussed in the Annif special part, which is coming right up. Yes, thanks. So to achieve our future plans that I just mentioned, we tried a few things that might be interesting to others that maybe want to do similar things. We found two main points. First, improving Annif's performance for our data set. First, what we do in terms of not suggested often enough, and what we do in terms of suggested too often, and also how we go beyond regular subject indexing. So not just our controlled terms, but other vocabularies that are not specifically subjects. One of these, I already mentioned, is marking some terms as main topics, and also getting Annif to predict other vocabularies, like, for example, our document genre study type, and also the ones I've mentioned before, age group and location. The first thing about improving performance I'm going to talk about is what happens when terms are not suggested often enough, correctly suggested often enough. One example our indexers reported to us is, of course, COVID-19. And the reasons we investigated and found were that the terms that were not suggested often enough are not or at all represented in the corpus. That means the machine learning backends haven't trained them well or at all. Either because the concept is really new, remember we have twice a year updates, and it simply hadn't been used yet to annotate documents, or it's just not been used much in the past. It existed, but nobody ever used it, and now it's suddenly become important. Solutions we found for that is to fine-tune our corpus year coverage. I mentioned before we only cover train years starting from 2014. So we try to make our training set as recent as possible to get as many current and new vocabulary terms in there. But of course, we're not going to be able to catch up ever with the updates. So this is where the lexical backend comes in. Sorry. For this, we activated scarce hidden labels in the MLM component. So the lexical backend has more things to work with, more labels to compare against. And we also try to add more of these labels to such problematic terms if we need them. What we do when terms are simply suggested way too often incorrectly, and that's in one word, blocking. Some examples are really broad, like health or treatment or learning, which is something that our indexers reported. These are just so broad in general that we, in most cases, just never use them because there's always a more specific term to use. The solution is we create block lists, so lists of terms that won't be suggested anymore, or hopefully less often by the backends that are bad at them. And what we wanted to do was create these block lists. Okay, yes, I think I'm making it. Automatically. So they're always up to date with our corpus and our vocabulary. The way we do blocking in Annif is we create a new vocabulary in scores and mark the two block terms as deprecated in our, because we found Annif won't suggest those. One small problem is that Annif doesn't support different vocabularies or block lists per backend component, which means for now we can only block certain terms completely. They won't be suggested at all anymore. It's not ideal, but for now we're going to use this complete blocking only for the automatic indexing. So for supporting human indexers, we will mark these terms that should be blocked probably as this is possibly too general, take with a grain of salt. How we did this, mainly we used a results file option in the Annif eval command that is possibly not well known. We've only found it quite recently to check the subject level goodness of each term in the vocabulary regarding the corpus and how it performs in suggestions. And then we went through terms that have bad values, a high false alarm rate, and calculate a score. And at one point for each of several indicators that might indicate that the term may be too broad. And if it reaches a threshold, we add the term to a block list and have human indexers go over this list to tell us, is this really something that you would block? And use the aggregated results to fine-tune our thresholds and repeat. These are, I think I'm going to skip these. You can read them at your leisure later, maybe. But we have several things that mark terms as blockable. Getting Annif to suggest terms as weighted or main topic is that we train Annif on two corpuses, one that just trained on the topics that are main topics, and the other training is on all topics that the human indexers used. And then we made an intersection and mark all of the terms that are suggested by Annif for the same document twice as weighted. So kind of like this. There's also the other vocabularies that we're trying to train, especially the controlled methods. We want, of course, to predict the controlled methods for our own sake, to annotate the documents with them, but also we want to use it to classify our documents as core and non-core for human or auto-indexing decision. Where we are right now at this is we've trained our Annif with our corpus and the CMs, and first results are pretty promising. What we still need to do is further testing and comparing to other methods of classifying into these two buckets. And then if we end up using Annif for that, how we're going to split the corpus and send one to auto-indexing and one to suggestions. Yes, and finally, the other vocabularies, just very quickly, I already talked about them a bit. For this, we needed them to be pretty specific and true. Where we are with that, age is trained and performs pretty well, but it's better at suggesting top concepts than their sub-concepts, which is possibly due to artificial upposting, which was done in the past in our database. So childhood was always automatically added when an indexer used infancy. Here's the infancy and here's childhood. So what we need to do is try to remove that programmatically somehow, or if that doesn't work, only suggest top concepts. And for population location, we're still at the very beginning, need to generate a vocabulary, train and test. So short overview of our workflow right now is manual indexing controlled terms are based on suggestions by Annif. And in the future, we want to have Annif classify into core and non-core. Core documents are manually indexed, but suggestions from Annif come for CT, age, controlled methods, and subject headings. And the non-core documents are indexed automatically for all of these vocabularies by Annif. So, I'm going to skip over this because you can look at it later. And we're done.
Okay, thank you very much. We have time for, I would say, 2 or 3 questions.
Hi, my name is Victoria. I'm from the National Library of Sweden. I was just wondering how many people has been involved in this project and what professions have they represented? Like how many catalogers
Yeah, the catalogers we have are, I think, about 10, and they're all psychologists. And the people who are doing the training and Annif work are mostly just me and Florian, or mostly Florian. And it's not everything we do, so maybe it's a 3/4 position. 3/4 people who do the Annif work. Very small team.
Thank you. Further questions? Osmar, of course.
Thank you. A very nice presentation, and I really liked the way you've been able to use the features of Annif for even your advanced cases. I was wondering, you mentioned that you have an ensemble of algorithms and you optimize the ensemble, but then you had problems with some terms that were suggested incorrectly and too often, and then the other way around as well. Did you use the neural network ensemble? Because it sort of tries to correct for this kind of biases. Maybe it doesn't work in all cases, but it's like it tries to do something similar to that.
And I defer.
Yes, I did some experimentation with the neural network ensemble, but the results weren't better.
It has to be added that these terms were reported by our indexers, and maybe, I mean, it's pretty subjective. Of course, we try to only block words that really have bad values in a high error rate, but the terms, it wasn't really bad per se, but our indexers noticed it.
Yes, one more question.
Jarmo Saarek from National Library of Finland. How about end users? Have they noticed the change about half a year ago, and what was the response?
Yeah, we're pretty upfront with that. I mean, they knew we needed to use a new system, and we talked to them, we showed them, we made a presentation that explained the difference between machine learning and our old system, and the response was something that you could talk about more, I think.
The previous system was pretty much a black box for our indexers, so they just got the suggestions in their interface. But with Annif, it was possible for him to play around with suggestions and put in sample text, and so the feedback was much more opinionated. So most vocal indexers, well, they gave the most feedback, but it wasn't really representative. But overall, the feedback was pretty well.
Yeah, so it's worth mentioning, we used, before we went into production with Annif, we made available the Annif user interface, where you can copy the text in and use the suggest button to get suggestions, and that's what we use to play around and complain. But overall, I think they're pretty happy.
They are happy, yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Tina and Florian.